This is a fictional American romance story created using AI for entertainment purposes only, intended strictly for audiences 18 years and older and not suitable for children under 18.
The rain started sometime after midnight. In Chicago, rain didn't fall softly the way it did in Seattle. It came down harder, more impatient, like the city itself had somewhere else to be. From the 27th floor of the Palmer Hotel, Adrian Cole watched the reflections of street lights smear across wet asphalt like melted gold. Taxis moved through the intersection below in slow yellow blurs, their headlights cutting through the storm. His laptop screen glowed on the desk behind him, still filled with structural models of a glass office tower he had been reviewing for the past 4 hours. He rubbed his eyes. Travel had a way of hollowing time out. Meetings blurred together, airports looked identical, and hotel rooms all smelled faintly of detergent and recycled air. His phone buzzed once on the nightstand. Adrian didn't turn around immediately. Messages at this hour were usually automated reminders or colleagues in different time zones. But the screen lit up the dark room. One message, from Lydia. He frowned slightly. Lydia almost never texted after midnight. She preferred calls, FaceTime, if she could convince him. He walked over and picked up the phone. 1:12 a.m. The message was short, just one line. We're separated for now. Adrian stared at it for a long time, not because he didn't understand it, but because he did. The rain tapped harder against the window. Separated. For now. 3 words that carried the quiet weight of something that had been building for months, maybe longer. He leaned against the edge of the nightstand and scrolled up through their previous messages. Photos Lydia had sent from a photography exhibition 2 weeks earlier. A picture of their dog, Milo, sprawled across the couch. A message from him 3 days ago. Landing in Chicago. Call you later. She had replied with a heart emoji. Nothing in those messages looked like the beginning of an ending, but Adrian knew appearances could lie. Lydia's life online was proof of that. On Instagram, she looked luminous, laughing on rooftops, capturing strangers in golden light, talking about creative freedom and living authentically. 200,000 followers believed her life was beautiful. Adrian had once believed it too. His thumb hovered over the keyboard. He could call her, demand an explanation, ask the question that had been sitting in the back of his mind for months. Is there someone else? Instead, he placed the phone on the bed and walked back to the window. The rain blurred the skyline. He thought about the last time he had seen Lydia in person. 6 weeks ago, Seattle. She had been editing photos at the kitchen island while music played softly from the living room. Adrian had been packing for another flight. Chicago again? She had asked without looking up. Just a week. She nodded. Your projects are getting bigger. He had smiled. That's the idea. There had been a pause then. One of those strange silences that had become more common between them. Not hostile, just empty. As if conversation had quietly run out of places to go. Back in the hotel room, Adrian picked up his phone again. The message was still there. We're separated for now. He imagined Lydia typing it. Did she hesitate? Did Marcus stand nearby while she wrote it? The name surfaced in his mind like a shadow he had tried not to examine too closely. Marcus Hale, podcast producer, confident, too charming. They had met during a creative project Lydia did last winter. Adrian had only met him once at a gallery opening. Marcus had shaken his hand with effortless ease. Man, your wife's work is incredible, he had said. Adrian had smiled politely, but something about the way Marcus looked at Lydia like she was already part of a story he was telling had unsettled him. Now the pieces rearranged themselves quietly. Late-night editing sessions, creative retreats, a sudden interest in finding space. Adrian sat on the edge of the bed. The city hummed beneath the rain. His phone vibrated again, not Lydia. A Slack notification from work. He ignored it. Slowly he typed a reply. Just one word. Okay. He read it once. No anger, no pleading, no question. Then he pressed send. The message delivered instantly. The 3 little dots the typing indicator did not appear. Adrian placed the phone face down on the nightstand. Outside, the rain softened. He turned off the lamp and lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling. Strangely, the feeling in his chest was not shock. It was something closer to relief. Because the thing that had been slowly breaking between them finally had a name. And names made things real. Across the country, in Seattle, Lydia would see that single word soon. Maybe she expected a fight. Maybe she expected tears. Instead, she would find silence. And sometimes silence was heavier than any argument. Adrian closed his eyes. The city kept moving. and somewhere far away, a marriage quietly changed shape. 3 months earlier, Seattle had been wrapped in the quiet glow of early spring. Cherry blossoms drifted across the sidewalks of Capitol Hill like pale pink snow, and the air smelled faintly of salt from the sound. In photos, the city looked soft and romantic. It was the kind of backdrop Lydia Cole knew exactly how to capture. On a cool Saturday morning, she stood in the middle of Pike Place Market with her camera raised, adjusting the aperture while a street violinist played somewhere behind her. "Hold still," she told the woman she was photographing. The woman laughed nervously. "I'm trying." Lydia smiled through the lens. Click. The shutter snapped once, then again. Lydia had a talent for seeing moments others overlooked. The tilt of sunlight against someone's cheek, the way strangers leaned closer when they talked, the invisible threads between people. It was why her photography account had grown so quickly. 200,000 followers now. Brands had started reaching out. Galleries had begun asking about collaborations. And somewhere along the way, the internet had started believing Lydia Cole was living a dream life. After the shoot, she sat at a nearby cafe editing photos on her laptop. Her phone buzzed every few minutes with notifications. Likes, comments, messages. One comment caught her eye. "Marcus Hale. That third shot is insane. You're getting better every week." She smiled without meaning to. Marcus had a way of saying things that felt like encouragement instead of praise. They had met during a storytelling project the previous winter. Marcus hosted a podcast about creativity and modern identity, and Lydia had been invited to talk about visual storytelling. The episode had performed well. Too well. Afterward, Marcus had suggested they collaborate on a series exploring artists in Seattle. It meant late-night planning calls, long conversations about ambition, and sometimes drinks afterward. Her phone buzzed again. A message from Adrian. "Boarding flight. Denver today. Back Thursday." Lydia stared at it for a moment. Then she typed, "Safe flight." A pause. She added a heart emoji. Across the country, Adrian would read that message somewhere above the clouds, believing it meant everything was still fine. But even then, Lydia already felt something shifting. That evening, the house in Ballard was quiet. The rain had returned to Seattle the way it always did, slow and steady, tapping against the large kitchen windows. Lydia edited photos at the island counter, while music drifted softly from the living room. The house was beautiful. Adrian had designed parts of it himself, and they bought it 5 years earlier. Clean lines, wide glass panels, a space meant to feel open. Yet lately it felt bigger. Too big. She opened Instagram and uploaded a new photo, a portrait of the violinist from that morning. Caption: "Every stranger carries a story." Within minutes, the likes began climbing. Marcus commented again. "Coffee tomorrow? I've got an idea for the podcast." She hesitated, then replied, "Sure." The next day, they met at a small cafe in Fremont. Marcus Hale had the kind of presence that filled the room before he spoke. Tall, relaxed posture, dark jacket that looked expensive but casual. When Lydia walked in, he stood and hugged her lightly. "You're becoming famous," he said, nodding toward her phone. She laughed. "Internet famous doesn't count." "It does in my industry." They sat by the window. Marcus leaned forward, excitement lighting his eyes. "I've been thinking about a new series," he said. "Something honest. Artists talking about the truth behind their lives." Lydia raised an eyebrow. "Truth?" "Yeah," Marcus said. "Not the polished version people post online." She stirred her coffee. "That might ruin half the internet." "Exactly." He studied her expression. "You ever feel like you're living two different lives?" The question landed heavier than she expected. "Sometimes," she admitted. Marcus nodded slowly. "People follow you because they believe you're brave enough to show reality." Lydia almost laughed at that. Reality. If people saw her life at 10 p.m. most nights, sitting alone editing photos while Adrian walked in another city, they might not find it inspiring. Marcus leaned back. "What does Adrian think about all this?" "He's supportive." "Supportive or absent?" She looked up. Marcus didn't look apologetic, just curious. "He travels a lot," Lydia said quietly. Marcus shrugged. "Ambition has a cost." Outside the cafe window, a train rattled across the Fremont Bridge. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Marcus said something that stayed with her long after the conversation ended. "You ever wonder who you'd become if you stopped waiting for someone else's schedule?" Weeks passed. The fractures appeared in small ways. Adrian missing dinner because of delayed flights, Lydia staying out later after shoots, phone screens turned slightly away during messages. Nothing dramatic, just tiny shifts in gravity. One night, Adrian returned from San Francisco close to midnight. The house was dark. Lydia sat on the couch scrolling through her phone. "You're back early," she said. Flight got moved. He dropped his bag near the door and walked over, kissing the top of her head. She smelled faintly of unfamiliar cologne. Or maybe it was just someone else's cologne lingering from a crowded bar. "Busy week?" he asked. "Yeah, Marcus and I are planning a series." Adrian nodded. "That podcast guy?" "Yeah, how is he?" She shrugged. "Driven." Adrian smiled faintly. "So are you." But later that night, as Lydia slept beside him, Adrian stared at the ceiling. Something felt different. Not wrong, just distant. Like two people standing on opposite sides of a wide room. Meanwhile, Marcus's presence in Lydia's life grew slowly, naturally. More meetings, more ideas, more conversations that stretched late into the night. He listened in a way Adrian no longer had time for. One evening, they walked along the Seattle waterfront after recording an episode. The ferries moved like glowing ghosts across the water. Marcus slipped his hands into his pockets. "You know what I admire about you?" he said. "What?" "You're standing at the edge of a completely different life." She looked at him. And most people are too afraid to step forward. The wind lifted strands of her hair. Behind them, the city lights shimmered across the bay. Lydia didn't say anything. But somewhere deep inside her, a quiet thought formed. Maybe Marcus was right. Maybe the life she had built with Adrian wasn't the only one waiting. And sometimes the first crack in a marriage didn't sound like breaking. Sometimes it sounded like possibility. Miles away, Adrian sat in another hotel room, staring at architectural blueprints, unaware that the quiet collapse had already begun. The morning after Adrian sent that single word, "Okay, Seattle," woke under a pale gray sky. Inside the Ballard house, Lydia Cole sat at the kitchen island with a mug of coffee growing cold in her hands. Her phone lay on the counter in front of her. Adrian's reply glowed faintly on the screen. "Okay." That was all. No anger, no questions, no late-night call demanding explanations. Just one word. Lydia had read it at least 20 times since 1:30 a.m., trying to understand what it meant. Was he calm, or was he simply done? The silence felt heavier than a fight would have. She exhaled slowly and opened Instagram. Her latest post, taken 2 nights earlier, showed a quiet street in Capitol Hill just after rain. Neon lights reflected across the pavement like spilled color. The caption she had written suddenly felt dishonest. "Sometimes the best stories begin with uncertainty." The likes continued climbing. People filled the comments with admiration. "You're living the dream. Seattle looks magical through your eyes. Your life inspires me." Lydia stared at the words. If only they knew. Her phone buzzed. A message from Marcus. "Saw your post. Everything okay?" She hesitated before replying. "Adrian and I are separated for now." The typing dots appeared immediately. That must be hard. Another pause. But maybe it's also the space you needed. Lydia leaned back in the chair. That word again. Space. Marcus had used it often over the past few months, as if distance itself were a kind of medicine. She typed slowly. Maybe. Then she stood up and walked to the wide kitchen windows. Outside, the rain had returned the soft Seattle kind that never fully stopped. For a moment, she imagined Adrian reading her message alone in some hotel room. But he had only replied with, "Okay," and closed the door. Later that afternoon, Lydia posted again. This time it was a black and white self-portrait. She stood in front of a foggy window, her reflection faintly overlapping her face. Caption: "Taking time to rediscover who I am." Within minutes, the responses flooded in. "Proud of you. Growth isn't easy. You deserve happiness." Lydia watched the reactions accumulate like digital applause. It felt strange how easily a private moment could transform into a narrative. In reality, she was sitting alone in sweatpants with unwashed hair. But online, it looked like bravery. Across the country in Chicago, Adrian's life had become quiet in a different way. 3 days after the message, he woke early in the same hotel room. The rain had stopped. Sunlight filtered between tall buildings, casting narrow lines across the carpet. His phone buzzed on the nightstand. He checked it out of habit. Several work emails, 2 Slack notifications, and a message from Lydia. Not a personal one, just a link. Her latest Instagram post. He stared at the caption. "Taking time to rediscover who I am." Adrian didn't open the comments. He set the phone down and went to the window. Chicago looked sharp in the morning light. Steel towers and glass surfaces reflecting the sky. He had another meeting in an hour, another design presentation, another set of people discussing square footage and environmental ratings. Life continued with ruthless normalcy. He shaved, dressed, and grabbed coffee from the lobby cafe downstairs. The barista glanced at his tired expression. Long night? Something like that. Back in the conference room later, Adrian stood beside the wall-size projection of the new office tower his firm was designing. Natural light will reduce energy consumption by nearly 20%, he explained to the clients. His voice sounded steady, professional. No one in the room knew that his marriage had quietly shifted into something undefined 3 nights earlier. No one needed to know. That evening, Adrian walked along the Chicago Riverwalk. The water reflected the city lights in long, trembling lines. He passed couples laughing over dinner, tourists taking photos, joggers weaving through the crowd. Everyone seemed to belong somewhere. Adrian stopped near the railing. His phone buzzed again. Another notification from Lydia's Instagram. Someone had tagged him in the comments. Adrian, you're lucky to have such a strong woman. He stared at the screen for a long moment. Then he muted notifications from her account. The silence that followed felt clean. For the first time in months, Adrian realized something unexpected. He didn't feel the urge to explain himself, or defend their marriage, or fight for a version of it that had already faded. Instead, he began thinking about the things he had postponed for years. A research fellowship in New York, a design competition in Copenhagen, trips he had avoided because Lydia didn't like long absences. Maybe the separation wasn't only hers. Maybe it belonged to both of them. Back in Seattle, Lydia met Marcus for dinner that weekend. The restaurant overlooked Elliott Bay, where ferries glided slowly through the dark water. Marcus studied her carefully across the table. "You seem lighter," he said. "Do I?" "You do." Lydia swirled the wine in her glass. "I posted about the separation today." Marcus nodded approvingly. "That's honest." "Is it?" she asked. "Well, it's your story." His tone was gentle but persuasive. "People connect with vulnerability. That's why your work resonates." Lydia looked out the window. Lights shimmered across the water. Adrian didn't react, she said quietly. "What do you mean?" He just replied, "Okay." Marcus leaned back slightly. Maybe he saw it coming. Maybe. But something about that single word unsettled her. It felt too calm, too final. Marcus reached across the table, resting his hand over hers. "You deserve to explore what life could be," he said softly. "For yourself." His hand was warm, comforting. Lydia didn't pull away. Over the next few weeks, her social media transformed. Posts about healing, about growth, about finding your voice. Her followers loved it. The engagement doubled. Brands began reaching out again. From the outside, Lydia Cole looked like a woman courageously reinventing herself. But at night, when the house grew quiet, she sometimes found herself opening the message thread with Adrian. That single word still sat there. Okay. No anger, no fight, just acceptance. And the strange thing about acceptance was that it didn't give her anything to push against. Meanwhile, Adrian had already begun changing in ways Lydia could not see. He stayed longer in Chicago after the project finished, accepted 2 new contracts, joined a small architecture group that met on Thursday nights to discuss experimental design. He stopped checking Lydia's social media, stopped imagining explanations. The quiet space in his life slowly filled with something unfamiliar. Peace. And sometimes, rebuilding a life didn't start with dramatic decisions. Sometimes it started with something much smaller, like choosing not to reopen a message. Far away, Lydia continued telling the world she was discovering herself. But the truth one she had not yet realized was that the freedom she felt might only be temporary. Because some choices did not reveal their cost immediately. And somewhere ahead, reality was waiting. By early summer, Seattle carried that rare stretch of sunlight the city waited all year for. The skies turned a pale, endless blue. Cafes moved their tables outside. Ferries glided across Puget Sound under golden evening light. For most people, the city felt alive. For Lydia Cole, it felt strangely theatrical. Her life had become a sequence of carefully framed moments. Brunch photos, studio shoots, quiet captions about growth and independence. Her followers loved it. But real life had grown less predictable. Across the table at a small rooftop bar in Belltown, Marcus Hale raised his glass. To reinvention, he said. Lydia clinked her drink against his. The skyline stretched behind them, glass towers glowing with sunset. You say that like it's easy, she said. Marcus smiled. It's easier than people think. Most people just don't give themselves permission. She studied him. Marcus always seemed so certain about everything. About people, about ambition, about the stories that shaped a life. Your followers love this version of you, he added casually. What version? The honest one. Lydia almost laughed. If honesty were truly the currency of the internet, half the world would vanish overnight. Still, she leaned back in her chair and looked around the rooftop. Young professionals laughed over cocktails. Someone played soft music from a portable speaker. For a moment, she believed Marcus. Maybe this really was the beginning of something new. Nearly 2,000 miles away, Adrian Cole stood in a quiet apartment in Chicago. It wasn't his apartment, not yet anyway. The place belonged to Daniel Ruiz, a former colleague from graduate school who now ran a boutique architectural firm. Daniel handed Adrian a second cup of coffee. You could take the spare room for a while, he said. Chicago isn't the worst city to disappear into. Adrian smiled faintly. Seattle's still home, for now. They sat at the kitchen table overlooking Lake Michigan. The water stretched gray and endless beyond the window. Daniel studied him carefully. You gonna talk about it? Adrian shrugged. Not much to say. You've been married 10 years. 11. Daniel whistled softly. And she just texted you? Pretty much. Daniel shook his head. That's cold. Adrian didn't respond, because the truth was more complicated than coldness. The marriage hadn't shattered overnight. It had eroded slowly, like waves wearing down a shoreline. The message had simply been the final tide. A week later, Adrian returned to Seattle for the first time since the separation. The house in Ballard looked exactly the same. The same maple tree in the yard, the same porch light glowing in the early evening. But when he unlocked the door, the silence inside felt different. Not hostile, just unfamiliar. Lydia wasn't home. Her camera bag sat near the couch, and a stack of photography magazines lay open on the coffee table. Adrian walked through the house slowly. The kitchen, the hallway, their bedroom. Her closet looked half empty now, some dresses gone, a few shoes missing. He didn't search for signs. He didn't need to. The house already told the story. Adrian packed a small suitcase with the rest of his belongings and left before Lydia returned. By the time she pulled into the driveway 2 hours later, the only thing missing was him. The revelation came a few days later. Not through Lydia, not through confrontation, through something much simpler. A friend. Adrian met Evan Parker for lunch downtown near Pioneer Square. Evan worked in marketing and had known Lydia since college. They sat outside at a cafe while pedestrians moved through the summer crowds. You look calm, Evan said carefully. Adrian shrugged. Working a lot. Yeah, about that. Evan hesitated. Adrian noticed immediately. What? Evan rubbed the back of his neck. Look, I didn't want to get involved, but I figured you should know. Adrian waited. There's a guy Lydia's been around lately, Evan said. Marcus Hale. The name landed without surprise. Adrian sipped his coffee. I've met him. Oh, Evan blinked. You knew? Not exactly, but you suspected. Adrian nodded once. Evan exhaled slowly. I saw them last week at a launch party for some podcasting. They looked close. Adrian watched the ferry horn echo faintly from the harbor. How close? Evan gave him an apologetic look. Not subtle. For a moment neither man spoke. Then Adrian simply nodded. Okay. Evan leaned forward. You're not mad? Adrian thought about that. Mad would have been easier, but anger required surprise. And deep down, the truth had arrived months ago, quietly, gradually. I think, Adrian said slowly, the worst part happened before the text. Evan frowned. What do you mean? The distance. He stared at the water. When someone leaves emotionally first, the rest is just paperwork. Later that night, Adrian made the mistake of opening Instagram again. He hadn't planned to, but curiosity had a strange gravity. Lydia's latest post appeared immediately. A photo taken during sunset on Elky Beach, the ocean glowing amber. Two shadows stretched across the sand. One was hers, the other clearly wasn't. In the corner of the frame, a familiar silhouette stood beside her. Tall, confident. Marcus. The caption read, "Some journeys begin when you let go of the past." The comments flooded with admiration. "You deserve happiness. Love this new chapter for you. You look radiant." Adrian stared at the image. Strangely, the pain he expected didn't come. Instead, he felt something quieter. Recognition. Because the truth was that Lydia hadn't betrayed him in that photograph. She had betrayed him months earlier in smaller ways. In the late-night conversations he wasn't part of. In the quiet emotional departures he hadn't known how to stop. The photos simply confirmed what already existed. Adrian closed the app. Then he placed the phone face down on the table. The room was silent except for the faint hum of traffic outside. Across the city, Lydia lay awake in her bedroom, staring at the ceiling. Marcus had left an hour earlier. Her phone buzzed with new notifications. She expected to see a message from Adrian. A question, an accusation, anything. But the screen remained empty. No call, no anger, just silence. And slowly, Lydia began to understand something unsettling. Adrian hadn't been waiting for the truth. He had already moved past the moment where it mattered. Outside, Seattle's summer night settled over the quiet streets, and somewhere between two separate lives, the illusion of control began to fracture. Because the next phase of Lydia's story would reveal something she had not expected. Freedom had a price, and she was only beginning to see the bill. By mid-July, Seattle's summer had settled into its rare, golden rhythm. Sunlight lingered late into the evening, stretching across rooftops and ferry docks. The city hummed with quiet optimism. Street musicians played near Pike Place, tourists filled the waterfront, and restaurant patios overflowed with laughter. From the outside, Lydia Cole's life seemed to match that warmth perfectly. Her follower count had climbed again. 200,000 had become nearly 300,000. Brands had started sending partnership offers. A lifestyle magazine had asked to feature her in an article titled "Artists Who Reinvented Themselves." But the attention had changed something, and Marcus Hale was at the center of it. One afternoon, Lydia sat inside Marcus's recording studio in Capitol Hill. The room smelled faintly of coffee and soundproof foam. Microphones hung from adjustable arms, and the glowing red light above the door read, "Recording." Marcus leaned back in his chair, tapping a pen thoughtfully against the desk. "I think we should do an episode about you," he said. Lydia frowned slightly. "About my photography?" Marcus smiled. "About your story." She folded her arms. "What story?" "The separation." The word landed heavier than she expected. Lydia shifted in her seat. "I don't know if I want to talk about that publicly." Marcus tilted his head. "Why not?" "Because it's personal." Marcus leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Lydia, the reason people connect with your work is honesty. They don't just follow the photos, they follow the person behind them." She stared at the microphone in front of her, a quiet black cylinder waiting for confession. Marcus continued gently. "You've already hinted at it online. The self-discovery posts, the captions about letting go. That's different." "How?" "Because they're abstract." Marcus smiled slightly. "That's exactly why people want the real story." Later that evening, they walked along Capitol Hill, the sunset painting the sky in soft oranges and purples. Marcus seemed energized. "You're standing on something powerful," he said. "A moment that people understand." Lydia frowned. "You're talking about my marriage like it's a marketing opportunity." Marcus laughed softly. "You say that like it's a bad thing." She stopped walking. "Marcus." He turned. "Yeah?" "My marriage ended." He shrugged lightly. "Relationships end all the time." The casualness in his voice unsettled her. "That doesn't make it content." Marcus studied her face for a moment. Then he softened his tone. "I'm not trying to exploit anything." "Then what are you doing?" "Helping you tell your story." She crossed her arms. "It's not finished yet." Marcus smiled faintly. "That's the best kind." A few days later, Lydia received an email from Marcus. Subject line, "Podcast episode outline." She opened it while sitting at her kitchen table. Inside were bullet points. Episode theme: Reinventing yourself after letting go. Talking points: Emotional distance in long marriages. Choosing personal growth over comfort. The courage to leave when something no longer feels right. Building a new identity after separation. At the bottom, Marcus had added, "Your story could inspire thousands of people." Lydia stared at the screen. Something about the phrasing felt rehearsed, as if her life had already been edited into a narrative arc. That evening Marcus came over for dinner. The Bellart house still had traces of Adrian, books on architecture, a framed sketch he had drawn years earlier of the Seattle skyline. Marcus wandered through the living room while Lydia cooked. "Nice place," he said. "Adrian designed parts of it." Marcus nodded casually. Well, he had good taste. Lydia placed plates on the table. "You're comfortable being here." Marcus sat down. "Why wouldn't I be?" She hesitated. "Because this was my marriage." Marcus took a sip of wine. "Was." The word echoed quietly in the room. After dinner, they moved to the couch. Marcus opened his laptop. "Check this out." He turned the screen toward her. It was a draft podcast description. Episode title: Living Without Losing Yourself. Below it was a paragraph summarizing Lydia's journey, her growing success, her realization that her marriage had limited her, and her decision to choose independence. Lydia read it slowly. "That's not what happened." Marcus frowned. "What do you mean? You wrote it like Adrian held me back." Marcus shrugged. "Well, didn't he?" "No." She closed the laptop gently. "He traveled for work. That's different." Marcus leaned back, slightly irritated. "You're missing the point." "What point?" "Stories need tension, a turning point." Lydia stared at him. "My life isn't a script." Marcus smiled thinly. "Everything becomes a script once people listen." Later that night, Lydia lay awake in bed. Marcus slept beside her. The room felt unfamiliar in the dark. She opened Instagram again. Her latest post had crossed 40,000 likes. The comments were filled with admiration. "You're so brave. Thank you for being honest about relationships. Your strength inspires me." Lydia stared at the screen. None of those people knew the real story. They only knew the version she had hinted at, a version Marcus seemed eager to expand. She placed the phone down and turned toward the window. Outside, Seattle's quiet streets glowed under streetlights. For the first time since the separation, Lydia felt something she hadn't expected: doubt. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, Adrian Cole was finishing a design presentation in Chicago. His colleagues clapped lightly as he concluded the proposal. "Impressive work," the project manager said. Adrian nodded politely. "Thank you." He packed his laptop and stepped outside into the warm night air. The city buzzed with energy bars full, traffic humming, laughter spilling onto sidewalks. For months, he had filled his days with work. But something had shifted recently. He no longer felt like he was running from anything. Instead, he was simply moving forward. His phone buzzed in his pocket. A notification. Out of habit, he glanced at it. A podcast preview clip had appeared on social media. Marcus Hale's voice filled the short video. "Next week, we talk with a photographer whose story of living a long marriage to rediscover herself is resonating with thousands of people." Adrian watched the clip for a moment. Then he slipped the phone back into his pocket. No anger, no bitterness, just quiet understanding. The fantasy Lydia had stepped into was beginning to reveal its shape, and he no longer needed to be part of it. Across the country, Lydia lay awake in the house she once shared with him. Marcus's breathing steady beside her, her phone glowing faintly on the nightstand. And somewhere beneath the carefully constructed narrative of freedom, a small realization began forming. Maybe the life she had stepped into wasn't as honest as she believed. Maybe it was simply another performance. By the time autumn returned to Seattle, 3 months had passed since the night Lydia sent the message. 3 months since Adrian replied with a single word: "Okay." Time did not move dramatically after that. It moved quietly, like tide water slipping along the shore. And in that quiet movement, 2 lives drifted farther apart. In Chicago, Adrian Cole had begun building a routine. Not the frantic schedule he had lived inside for years, flying between cities and presentations, always measuring time by project deadlines. This routine was slower, more deliberate. He woke early now, usually just before sunrise. The apartment Daniel had helped him find overlooked a stretch of the Chicago River where morning light reflected off glass towers in soft amber tones. Adrian started each day with a walk. No phone, no emails, just the city waking up around him. He passed a small bakery where the same woman unlocked the door every morning at 6:30. Joggers moved along the river walk. Delivery trucks rumbled quietly through the streets. At first, the silence had felt strange, but gradually it became something else: peace. Work remained part of his life, of course. Architecture had always been more than a career for Adrian. It was the way he understood the world, how structures held together, how tension and balance created stability. Lately, he had begun exploring ideas he had neglected for years. Experimental designs, public spaces built around natural light and human movement rather than corporate prestige. One evening, during a design workshop, a younger architect studied Adrian's sketches. "You ever think about teaching?" she asked. Adrian smiled faintly. "Sometimes. You'd be good at it." He shrugged. "I spent a long time building things other people wanted. And now?" He glanced at the drawing. "Now I'm curious what I might build for myself." The biggest change, however, was not professional. It was personal. For years, Adrian's life had revolved around the rhythm of marriage, shared dinners, weekend plans, quiet negotiations about travel schedules. Now the rhythm belonged only to him. At first, the freedom had felt hollow, but slowly he began rediscovering things he had forgotten he loved. Reading novels late at night, sketching buildings that would never be constructed, playing piano again in the evenings, something he had abandoned years earlier when work became too demanding. Sometimes he even left more easily with Daniel and their circle of friends. One night, Daniel raised an eyebrow while they sat at a bar near Wicker Park. "You're different," he said. "How?" "You're lighter." Adrian sipped his drink. "Maybe I'm just sleeping more." Daniel studied him carefully. "You miss her?" Adrian thought about the question. The answer surprised him. "I miss who we used to be," he said quietly. Daniel nodded. "Yeah." But Adrian no longer felt the constant pool of unfinished conversation. The chapter had already begun closing in his mind. Meanwhile, in Seattle, Lydia's life continued to move forward, but not as smoothly as it appeared online. Her podcast episode with Marcus had gone live a month earlier. It was successful, very successful. Thousands of downloads, comments filled with praise for her courage. Marcus had celebrated that night with champagne and excitement. "See," he said, "people needed to hear your story." Lydia smiled politely, but something about the episode had unsettled her. Listening to it afterward felt like hearing a stranger describe her life. The narrative Marcus had crafted was clean and inspiring. A woman realizing her marriage had confined her, a brave leap into independence. But the real story was messier, lonelier, and far less certain. The distance between Lydia and Marcus had begun growing in subtle ways. He remained charming, ambitious, always chasing the next project. But now Lydia noticed how often he turned real experiences into material. At dinner one evening, Marcus spoke excitedly about future episodes. "We could do a follow-up about dating again after marriage," he said. Lydia frowned. "I'm not dating." Marcus smiled. "Technically." She stared at him. "You're serious?" "People would relate to it." "Marcus," she said slowly, "my life isn't a series." He shrugged. "Everything is a series if you look at it right." The verse lingered in the air between them. Later that night, Lydia scrolled through old photos on her phone. Pictures from years earlier. Adrian laughing on a ferry ride to Bainbridge Island. The two of them painting the walls of the Ballard house after they bought it. A blurry selfie taken during a road trip along the Oregon coast. Those moments looked ordinary now, but they carried a quiet warmth she had not noticed while living inside them. She wondered where Adrian was tonight. Chicago, probably. Working late like always. Yet something told her his life had changed too, maybe more than she realized. A week later, Lydia attended a gallery opening downtown. The room buzzed with conversation and clinking glasses. She moved through the crowd politely, accepting compliments about her photography. "You're doing amazing things," someone said. "Your story is so inspiring," said another. Lydia smiled, but the praise felt strangely hollow. Later she stepped outside onto the quiet sidewalk for air. The autumn wind carried the scent of rain. Her phone buzzed. For a brief moment she wondered if it might be Adrian. It wasn't. Just another notification from social media. She stared at the screen, then slipped the phone back into her bag. For the first time since the separation, Lydia felt the full weight of something she had been avoiding. Regret didn't arrive suddenly. It arrived slowly, like fog rolling across the water. At first you barely noticed it. Then suddenly everything looked different. That same evening in Chicago, Adrian sat at his apartment piano. The melody was soft and hesitant. He had not played in years, but the muscle memory returned gradually. Outside the window, the city lights shimmered along the river. He paused and glanced at his phone. No new messages, no reminders of the life he had left behind. For the first time in a long time, the silence felt complete. Not lonely, just open. And sometimes distance didn't simply separate two people. Sometimes it revealed who they became without each other. Back in Seattle, Lydia lay awake again in the house that had once felt too big. Now it felt empty in a different way, because somewhere along the path toward freedom, she had begun to realize something painful. The life she had left behind had not been perfect, but it had been real. And real things were harder to replace than she had expected. By late October, Seattle had returned to its familiar gray. The sky hung low over the city, and rain traced quiet lines down the windows of cafes and office towers. Leaves gathered along sidewalks in wet clusters of red and gold. It was the kind of weather that made the city feel reflective. Adrian Cole stepped out of a taxi near Pioneer Square just after noon. He hadn't been back in Seattle for months. Chicago had slowly become routine. His apartment, his work, the quiet rhythm he had rebuilt piece by piece, but a new project had brought him back to the West Coast for a week, and returning felt stranger than he expected. The city looked exactly the same, but he didn't. The first 2 days passed quickly. Meetings, site visits, the presentation at a development office overlooking Elliott Bay. Adrian moved through the schedule calmly, speaking with the quiet confidence that had always defined him professionally. None of his colleagues mentioned Lydia. In the architecture world, personal lives were rarely discussed unless someone volunteered the information, and Adrian had stopped volunteering long ago. On Wednesday evening, he walked alone through Capitol Hill. The neighborhood buzzed with life, restaurants glowing with warm light, music drifting from bars, couples walking under umbrellas. It reminded him of earlier years. Back when he and Lydia had first moved to Seattle. They used to come here on Friday nights. Cheap cocktails, late conversations, a future that still felt wide open. Adrian paused at a crosswalk as rain began to fall harder. His phone vibrated in his coat pocket. He almost ignored it, but the name on the screen made him stop. Lydia. For a moment, he simply looked at it. The last time she had contacted him directly was months earlier about a tax document they needed to sign. Nothing personal, nothing emotional, just logistics. He answered, "Hello." Her voice sounded softer than he remembered. "Adrian." A pause lingered between them. "I heard you're back in Seattle," she said. "Just for work." Another pause. "I was wondering," Lydia hesitated, "if we could talk." Adrian watched raindrops slide down the cafe window beside him. "What about?" "Us." The word hung in the air. Not dramatic, just honest. Adrian exhaled slowly. "All right." They agreed to meet the next evening at a small waterfront cafe near Elliott Bay. The place had once been one of Lydia's favorites. She arrived early. The rain had eased into a light mist, and the water beyond the windows looked dark and endless. Lydia sat at a table near the glass, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea. She had rehearsed what she wanted to say, but now that the moment had arrived, the words seemed scattered. When Adrian finally walked in, she recognized him immediately. Not because he looked the same, but because he didn't. He seemed calmer somehow, less burdened by the invisible weight he had carried for years. He approached the table and gave a polite smile. "Hi." "Hi." They sat across from each other. For a moment neither spoke. The silence wasn't hostile, just unfamiliar. Adrian broke it first. "How have you been?" Lydia let out a small breath. "Busy. I've seen some of your work." Her eyes lifted slightly. "You still look at my page?" "Not often." That honesty stung more than she expected. "And you?" she asked. "How's Chicago?" "Good." "Just good?" He shrugged lightly. "I like the routine." Lydia studied him carefully. "You seem different." Adrian smiled faintly. "I probably am." The waitress brought coffee for Adrian. Steam rose slowly from the cup between them. Finally, Lydia leaned forward slightly. "I wanted to talk because..." She paused. "Because things didn't end the way they should have." Adrian nodded once. "That's true. I hurt you." He didn't immediately respond. Instead, he watched the ferry move slowly across the water outside. Then he said quietly, "The hurt didn't start with the text." Lydia swallowed. "I know." They both understood the truth without needing to explain it. The distance had begun long before Marcus, before social media, before even the long business trips. It had begun in the quiet ways people slowly stopped sharing themselves. "Are you still seeing him?" Adrian asked after a moment. Lydia shook her head. "No." He didn't look surprised. "It didn't last," she continued softly. "What happened?" She gave a tired smile. I realized I was part of his content strategy. Adrian raised an eyebrow. That sounds unpleasant. It was. The honesty between them felt strangely freeing. For the first time in months, Lydia wasn't performing a version of herself. She was simply speaking. I kept telling people I was discovering who I was, Lydia said. And I'm not sure I actually knew. Adrian listened quietly. Everything became a story online, she continued. And after a while, I didn't know which parts were real anymore. Outside the cafe window, rain tapped gently against the glass. Lydia looked down at her hands. I thought leaving would make things clearer. Did it? She met his eyes. Not the way I expected. Adrian leaned back slightly in his chair. Clarity usually comes later, he said, after the damage. The words were calm, not bitter. That made them harder to hear. Lydia hesitated before asking the question she had been avoiding. Are you happy? Adrian thought about it. I'm peaceful. She nodded slowly. I'm glad. And she meant it, even though a small part of her wished the answer had been different. For a while they spoke about ordinary things. Work, friends, the city. It felt almost like the conversations they used to have years earlier, but the emotional terrain between them had changed. Finally, Lydia asked the question she had feared. Do you ever think about trying again? Adrian didn't answer immediately. He watched the water outside. When he finally spoke, his voice was gentle. I think we loved each other once. The words were careful, past tense. And now? Lydia asked quietly. Adrian looked at her. I think we became different people. The truth settled softly between them. Not dramatic, just undeniable. Lydia felt tears threaten, but managed a small smile. You always were the honest one. Adrian laughed softly. Not always. They finished their drink slowly. Outside, the rain had stopped. The clouds over Elliot Bay began to thin slightly, revealing faint silver light on the water. When they stood to leave, Lydia felt an unexpected sense of calm. Not closure exactly, but something close. At the door, Adrian paused. Take care of yourself, Lydia. You too. They hesitated briefly, then hugged. It was a simple embrace. Two people who had once shared a life, and who now understood why that life had ended. As Adrian walked away toward the street, Lydia remained by the window for a moment, watching the grey water stretch toward the horizon. For the first time in months, she wasn't thinking about posts or narratives or followers. She was simply thinking about the truth. And sometimes, the hardest realization wasn't that love had ended. It was that both people had changed enough to let it. 2 days after their conversation by Elliot Bay, Seattle woke beneath a sky the color of brushed steel. Rain drifted lightly across the city again, blurring the outlines of buildings and ferry docks. It was the kind of quiet weather Seattle understood best. Adrian Cole stood in the living room of the Ballard house one last time. The realtor had arranged the final paperwork that morning. The house would be listed next week. For years, this place had been the center of his life. The long windows facing the street, the wooden staircase he had helped design, the kitchen where Lydia used to stand editing photos while music played softly in the background. Now the rooms were empty, furniture gone, walls bare. Adrian walked slowly through the space, his footsteps echoing faintly across the hardwood floor. He paused near the window where Lydia once liked to photograph the rain sliding down the glass. For a moment he could almost see her there again, camera raised, eyes focused, always searching for the perfect frame. He smiled faintly. Then he turned away. Across the city, Lydia Cole sat alone at a cafe near Green Lake. Her laptop was open in front of her, but she hadn't touched the keyboard in nearly 20 minutes. The cursor blinked inside the Instagram caption box. She had uploaded a photo earlier that morning. Not a portrait, not a carefully staged self-image, just a simple photograph of the lake at dawn. Grey water, soft fog drifting above the surface. No people. For once, the image wasn't about telling a story. It was simply what she saw. But now the caption felt impossible to write. For months, she had turned every emotion into language that sounded wise. Growth, healing, reinvention. The words had once felt powerful. Now they felt rehearsed. Her phone buzzed with notifications. Likes rising, comments arriving. The usual rhythm. Yet Lydia didn't open them. Instead, she stared out the cafe window at the quiet path circling the lake. Adrian's voice from their conversation echoed gently in her memory. I think we became different people. The sentence had hurt. But it had also carried something unexpected: respect. The truth had come slowly after that meeting, in small realizations. She began replaying the moment from months earlier when she sent the message. "We're separated for now." At the time she had expected questions, anger, maybe even a fight that would prove their relationship still held passion. But Adrian hadn't done any of those things. He had simply replied, "Okay," and closed the conversation. For a long time Lydia interpreted that silence as indifference. Now she understood it differently. It hadn't been indifference, it had been dignity. Adrian had refused to turn their private collapse into a spectacle, even when she had accidentally done exactly that. Later that afternoon, Lydia walked through Pike Place Market with her camera. The crowds moved around her, tourists laughing, vendors shouting about fresh fish, musicians playing near the entrance. For months she had photographed scenes like this for social media, but today she moved more slowly, observing rather than performing. She stopped near a flower stall where a young couple argued quietly about which bouquet to buy. The woman laughed suddenly. The tension disappeared. Lydia raised her camera. Click. The moment froze inside the frame. A real moment, messy and imperfect. She lowered the camera and smiled softly. Maybe that was the kind of photography she wanted again. Not stories shaped for an audience, just truth. That evening, Adrian sat in his hotel room packing his suitcase. His flight to Chicago left early the next morning. The room felt temporary in the way hotel rooms always did. Neutral colors, soft lighting, no personal history attached to the walls. He zipped the suitcase closed and sat down by the window. Seattle's skyline shimmered faintly in the distance. For the first time in months, he thought about Lydia again, not with tension, but with quiet clarity. They had loved each other. That part was real. But love alone didn't freeze people in time. People changed. Ambition changed them. Loneliness changed them. Even success could quietly reshape a person's priorities. And sometimes, two people simply grew in directions that no longer aligned. Adrian didn't blame Lydia for that. He had his own absences, his own long nights lost inside work. The marriage had not collapsed because of one moment. It had faded through hundreds of small ones. His phone buzzed, a notification. Lydia had posted something new. For a second he considered ignoring it. Then curiosity won. He opened the image. The photo showed Green Lake at dawn, soft fog hovering above the water. The caption was simple: "Some stories don't end with anger, they end with understanding." Adrian read the line twice, then he closed the app. No comment, no message, just quiet acknowledgement. The next morning, Lydia woke early. The city was still half asleep when she stepped outside with her camera. Fog hung low over the streets. She walked toward the waterfront, following the same path she and Adrian had once taken during their first year in Seattle. Back then, everything had felt new. Possibilities everywhere. At the pier, she stopped and looked across Elliott Bay. A ferry moved slowly across the water. Somewhere beyond that horizon, Adrian's plane would soon be lifting into the sky, returning him to the life he had rebuilt. For a moment, Lydia wondered what would have happened if she had chosen differently months ago, if she had spoken honestly before the distance grew too wide. But regret was a strange emotion. It pointed backward, never forward. So she simply raised her camera again. Click. Another moment captured. Not perfect, but real. Thousands of miles away, Adrian sat by the airplane window as the aircraft climbed through the clouds. Seattle shrank beneath him, a city full of memories, but not a prison, just a chapter. He opened a notebook and began sketching a new building concept he had been thinking about all week. Light wells, open public space, a structure designed to change with the seasons. As the plane leveled out above the clouds, sunlight flooded through the cabin windows. Adrian looked out at the endless white horizon. For the first time in a long time, the future felt wide again. Not empty, just open. Back in Seattle, Lydia continued walking along the waterfront. The fog slowly lifted. Sunlight touched the water. And somewhere inside her, a quieter understanding had finally settled. Adrian's silence that night had never meant he didn't care. It meant he cared enough to live without turning their pain into something smaller than it deserved. She had mistaken dignity for distance, but now she saw it clearly. Some doors closed loudly. Others simply remained open behind you, not for returning, but as a reminder of where you once stood, and how far you had come.